Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president and also the Socialist Party candidate in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. So we were going to have Claire Cohen on today. She actually has to take a test to, get her medical license renewed or updated. So she's going to be on December 17th, and we'll talk more about the healthcare issue. But it's an issue every week. I mean, this week it was around this contract for the rail workers, and all they wanted was paid sick leave. They have horrendous schedules, and they wanted paid sick and family leave. They asked for 15 days, and the president and Congress, instead of shoving the contract down their throat, should have at least amended it so it had these 15 days of paid sick leave. Instead, the House passed basically a performative bill for show. So the liberals could, say, well, they voted for sick days. It was only 7 sick days. And then, of course, the Senate defeated it like everybody knew they would. And Biden signed the bill. And, this just really makes me angry. We're like the last country in the world without paid sick leave. And we're still in the middle of a pandemic. It's flu season, RSV's going around. And they're basically forcing people to go to work sick who, can't afford to take the time off, or they get in disciplinary trouble if they do. So this is ridiculous. And, being a Teamster and UPS, the last contract we had was shoved down our throat after like the majority of rail workers, majority of Teamsters voted that contract down. But there was a clause in the Constitution, if we didn't pass it by or voted down by 2/3, Jimmy Hoffa Jr. in the leadership of the Teamsters could shove that contract down our throats, and they did. And it was a terrible contract. I mean, I won't go into all the details, but probably the most glaring was they set up a new category of drivers who are paid much less than the senior drivers. It's basically a 2-tier system. So as the seniors retire out, the new workers work at a lower level. And there's just a whole lot of problems with that contract. And it'll be a big issue this coming year because next July 31st, that contract is over. So Teamsters are getting ready. They're working right now on negotiating, and it might lead to a strike. And there's no federal law that can prevent the Teamsters from striking like there is in this law that gives the Congress the right to impose a contract and, prohibit a strike, which is where we're at right now. And, to make this worse, back in 2015, Obama passed or wrote an executive order giving all employees of federal contractors 7 days paid sick and family leave with a carve out for rail workers. So they didn't get it. And all the railroads have lots of federal contracts. So they picked on the rail workers. And, now that this contract has been imposed, people are demanding that Biden amend or pass a new executive order to give those 7 sick days to rail workers like other employees of federal contractors. Well, Biden could do that, but and that's the demand now, but I'm not holding my breath. And this is so disgusting because the railroad companies are the most profitable industrial sector or any sector in the economy. They made over $80 billion in profits last year. And the benefits they're paying the workers was $336 million. So they could easily have covered paid sick days. And profits have been going up for decades. They were a rate of 15%, which is really good, back in 2001. Last year, they were 41%. And meanwhile, the spending on workers' wages and benefits was 34% of all revenues for the railroads in 2001, and it's down to 20% in 2021. So they're taking it out of the workers' hides, and they're spending it on dividends and stock buybacks, which were less than $1 billion a year in 2001 and were $18 billion last year. So these profits from super exploitation of these rail workers is going into the hands of the rich. And so, why did the Democrats capitulate? Well, they're a capitalist party. They say so. Nancy Pelosi told us. The railroad company spent $5 to $10 million on campaign donations each election cycle in recent cycles. About 2/3 Republicans, but 1/3 the Democrats. They spent $13 million on lobbying this year. So, the Democrats, they'll pander to any capitalists who might give them money, even if they're giving more money to the Republicans. I think that's what we see going on here. Now, there's a progressive cross-union, cross-craft rail workers reform caucus called Railroad Workers United. And, they've been calling in the course of this for public ownership of the railroads, so they're operating in the interest of the workers and the public, universal paid and family sick leave, labor law reforms, including passing the PRO Act and increasing National Labor Relations Board funding. PRO stands for protecting the right to organize, would allow for things like card check union recognition, where when you get a majority of people to sign the card, you're a bargaining unit that the employer has to deal with. And then after Biden shoved this down their throats, they called for, reassessing their political options and looking into an independent workers' party. So these are people we should be working with. And, now they're stuck with this contract. And I don't expect wildcat strikes. That would really cause disciplinary problems, fines to the unions. I mean, they're really over a barrel now. Thanks to the Democrats, who call themselves the pro-labor party, and they just showed themselves that they're not, or showed us all that they're not. And another union came out this week also calling for universal paid sick leave. They had an appeal yesterday calling for stronger public and occupational health and safety standards in light of the growing COVID, flu, and RSV infections and overwhelming the hospital systems we're seeing right now. And they in particular condemn the quote unquote immunity deficit concept that's circulating, including from a CDC spokesperson last week that says because children were protected during the COVID period, they have an immunity deficit, therefore we need to let them get infected with RSV. That's unscientific. There's no such thing as an immunity deficit. Your immune system works all the time. And it's dangerous because, particularly for children, RSV can be life-threatening or it can kill them. And so, and then you had a statement, National Nurses United had a statement out, showing why, explaining why this immunity deficit concept is unscientific and dangerous. And, like the railroad workers called for universal sick and paid family leave, like almost every other country in the world, except a few outliers like Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, and the United States. I mean, this is so disgusting. It just pisses me off because people get sick and die. They go to work and spread, illnesses to other people because we won't provide paid sick leave. It's just unbelievable. So, speaking of health issues, also, we've all seen these protests in China over the COVID lockdowns and the very draconian kind of restrictions people are under. And I think it's important to understand that these people are calling for freedom. A lot of them are calling for democracy. This is not like the right-wing anti-vax demos in the West. Nobody's saying don't vaccinate. The vaccines are, going to kill us or whatever the anti-vax people are saying. It's really about resisting the pervasive surveillance that has been enhanced and intensified with the zero COVID lockdowns and contact tracing. And there are a couple of articles. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about that, but I'm going to put them in the chat. One is by Promise Lee. It's entitled Socialists Should Support the Popular Resistance in China. And it appeared in one of the DSA publications, Socialist Call. And I know Promise, he's an exiled Hong Konger, who's fighting for socialism here and in China. And he has a good explanation of, why these are not like the right-wing anti-vax demos here, and also why we should support them and how we can. And then the other article is by Jonathan Neal, who's a socialist climate activist in the UK. It was in The Ecologist. It's entitled China, COVID, and Climate. And I'll also mention his book, Fight the Fire, which came out last year. It's one of the best on the climate crisis from an eco-socialist perspective that I've seen. And, if you read Neal's article at the end, he has an interesting discussion about how the global left is realigning itself between those forces that are moving left toward a democratic internationalism that supports working class and pro-democracy movements resisting state capitalist dictatorships like Russia, China, Syria, Iran, and an authoritarian left that's moving right and supporting these dictatorships as somehow anti-imperialist and progressive. So I urge you to read that and think about what he says. And he particularly, with respect to the climate movement, a lot of climate activists who are generally progressive, if not socialists, don't want to talk about the lack of democracy in China because they have hope that it's a progressive dictatorship that's going to do what needs to be done to deal with the climate crisis. Unlike quote unquote messy democracies where, it's a struggle. But at least in messy democracies, we can fight for what we want. Whereas in China, the line comes from the top down. And, that view is anything but the people that want to rely on these progressive dictatorships is anything but a class analysis because the Chinese capitalists have an interest in the massive fossil fuel projects that they still do, even if they're building out the biggest solar panel industry. That's another, profitable opportunity, but they're not stopping the fossil fuels to the extent it needs to happen. I mean, they have cut back, particularly because of the air pollution in cities like Beijing, where the air got so bad it was just, destroying people's lungs. And this is important because China is not only 20% of the world's population, but 40% of the industrial workers of the world who have a lot of social weight when it comes to making radical change because they can go on strike and stop everything until their demands are met. Meanwhile, China accounts for 30% of all global carbon emissions, which is more than the US and EU combined at this point. So what happens in China is key to solving the climate crisis and the other economic and war crises that come out of global capitalism. So I'm just saying we need to find ways of being in practical solidarity with Chinese pro-democracy and working class and eco-socialist activists because, like us, they're in the belly of one of the two biggest capitalist powers in the world. And so, we both got to deal with our own ruling classes and social systems and, support each other in transforming them. And, last thing I'll comment on is I find it ironic, after I did that review of the Real Path to Peace in Ukraine panel a couple of weeks ago, put on by Answer and Code Pink and so forth. And, they were saying the U.S. should negotiate with presumably Russia. They're kind of vague. They're just saying, calling for negotiations. Well, on Thursday, Biden said he was ready to negotiate with Putin if he's ready to end the war. And Putin, through his spokesperson, Peskov, said, no, we're not negotiating until the U.S. recognizes the Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine that Russia claims it has annexed. So, I'm wondering, so what is Answer and Code Pink going to do now? Are they going to demonstrate at the Russian embassies calling for negotiations? Unfortunately, I don't think so. And another thing I'd note about that is Biden said that with Macron at his side, the French president. And Macron has, continued to try to negotiate and talk to Putin, throughout this war. And Biden said when he made a statement with Macron right there that he would negotiate in consultation with the NATO countries. He didn't mention Ukraine, which now, he gaffes a lot. Maybe that was unintended. He forgot. But I think it could also mean that NATO and, including Biden and Macron are ready to sell out Ukraine in a land for peace deal to get the war over with, which is, costly to the Western countries and disrupted the economy. And that would be unfortunate. It would be a inter-imperialist agreement on dividing spheres of influence, which is what imperialist countries do. And it accepts an international order of inter-imperialist competition and rivalry that even if they have an agreement about Ukraine, it by its own logic, it can only lead to more wars and at some point nuclear war. So that's why we need a global eco-socialist revolution. We got to support people in every country fighting, the ruling classes for democracy and socialism. And that will put an end to the militaristic competition among capitalist states, as well as the endless growth of fossil fuels and other dangerous production that's imperiling our whole environment and basically our existence. So those are my comments for this week, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Susan Jane Hogarth, are you against arming Ukraine then? No, Ukraine has a right to defend itself from imperialist invaders. And where else are they going to get the arms but from the US and the NATO countries? They have a right to self-defense. It's a national liberation struggle. We should support them against the Russian imperialists. Gregory Mallard, what's your opinion on having GPUS leaders along with local and state Green Party chairs attending union meetings? Yeah, we should. And whenever, we can, whenever it's appropriate. I've done it many, many times, not just in my own union, but with other unions. We should build relationships with the union leaders, staff, and the rank and file. It just depends. Every union is different degrees of democracy, different levels of rank and file organization. But yeah, we should be building those relationships because as the Rail Workers United said this week, in response to getting screwed by the Democrats and Republicans, we need a workers' party. And so they're a union that we should be, well, it's a reform caucus. It's a union. It's a labor organization, not a union with contracts with the rail companies, but it's, a rank and file caucus across the different rail unions. We should be, talking with those folks is just one example. And, every industry, you can find people like that we should be in touch with, as well as the formal union process. And you will find sometimes you just won't get in the front door. And other times you'll find that the rank and file will overrule the leadership. I mean, I had a case of that in 2018 running for governor. I was the only gubernatorial candidate that asked the Buffalo Federation of Teachers for their endorsement. I had it in 2014 along with 6 other local unions against the wishes of the state union federation because they'd had it with Cuomo. And so I met with their political committee, which made a recommendation to their executive committee, which recommended to the membership meeting that the union be neutral on the election. So they weren't endorsing Cuomo, they weren't endorsing me, they weren't endorsing the Republican, they were just staying out of it. And the rank and file said, no, we want to endorse Howie. And they overruled the executive committee recommendation, and I got the endorsement. So you build those relationships. And I've worked with some of those teachers in Buffalo. And, it's definitely something Green should do more of. Scout Trooper 164, what is your view and prediction for the Georgia runoff? Well, my view is, I'm rooting for Warnock, obviously. Herschel Walker doesn't know what the hell he's doing. He's just not qualified to even understand what's going to come before him in the Senate. Prediction, I haven't studied it closely, but I do get the sense from what news reports I've heard that, the Walker campaign is losing enthusiasm even from its own people. The lieutenant governor in Georgia said he went into the polling place and decided not to vote for the Republican or the Democrat. He walked in, left him a blank ballot, and walked out, which is not a good signal for the Republicans. And Herschel Walker's, been He doesn't have a fire in his belly. He's not really out there campaigning. That's what I've heard from the news reports. All that is, probably good news for Warnock. So I guess if I had to predict, if I was forced to make a bet, I'd bet on Warnock. Via email, what are your thoughts on the 15-year-old Warnock canvasser in Georgia who was shot? That's terrible. I just saw the New York Times article on that. They're not saying the shooter had a motivation. He shot through his front door, which had windows, so probably saw who the kid was. And, it just tells me, people are too quick on the trigger. We'll find out if it was, politically motivated or a sick person or what it was. But that's terrible. And, when that kind of violence happens in the course of an election, it discourages people from participating. So we'll have to wait to get a definite, report on what motivated this. Now the kid was shot in the leg. Apparently, it's not life threatening, but that's just terrible. And it's that kind of violence that's undermining our democracy and has been encouraged by a lot of those Republican right wingers, starting with Donald Trump. So we got a problem, and we got to speak out against that kind of incitement to violence. Donald Trump should get his butt kicked running for president. Whether he will or not, we'll see. The problem with the Republicans is they don't have ranked choice voting or proportional representation of the votes for the delegates, for the presidential candidates, and therefore their delegates in the convention. It's winner take all, state by state. So all the anti-Trump candidates split the vote amongst themselves, and Trump, and this happened in 2016, he got through with, rarely more than 30% of the vote in the states. And, that's another argument for proportional representation. So anyway, I just hope the kid is going to be all right, and the shooter, whatever his motive. The thing that shocked me, his bail was only like $5,600 or something. I know the bail they have around here in New York is for something like that would be much, much higher, which just raised the flag for me. So we'll have to wait for more reports, but it's just a sad thing and a terrible thing that happened. Scout Trooper 164, Howie, how do you feel that someone on the New York Times finally asked for the charges against Julian Assange to be dropped? I feel like it's about time. The New York Times used WikiLeaks documents that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks provided to them for a number of stories, in 2010 and in that period. And they've been largely silent as the U.S. has gone after Julian Assange for publishing or making those documents available. So it was the New York Times editorial board in combination with 4 other global news outlets, Der Spiegel, El País in Spain, I think it was Le Monde in France, and The Guardian in England. And so, I was glad to see that statement. I hope they now campaign and not just let that be a one-off, because, extraditing Assange to the U.S. is going to be a real strike against a free press and democracy. And it's, they said the charges should be dropped. That's what I've been saying. That's what everybody should be saying. And that's what the Biden administration should do. I mean, it was Trump. Obama said we can't prosecute Assange because it'd be a danger to the free press. Of course, then Trump did it, and Biden's continued it. So, tell me again, those liberals that said you got to vote for Biden to stop Trump, well, this is one area where it didn't make any damn difference. So, free Julian Assange. It's about time. Andrew Hager, Howie, what can we do to show our support to the railroad strikers? Well, at this point, we got to, see what their lead is. Excuse me. The one thing they have said is we should be demanding that Biden modify that Obama executive order or issue a new one to extend 7 days sick leave to the railroad workers who are now exempt from Obama's executive order. That's the immediate thing they're asking for. I don't think they'd go on strike. The consequences would be too great. So I think, right now what we got to do is, send a message to the White House, phone, email, telegram, however you want to do it, and say the railroad workers should get sick leave. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of same-sex marriage finally getting through the Senate? I think it's good. And it really shows, the politicians in the end have their, fingers to the wind. And when something's overwhelmingly popular, they're going to go with it. And, the amazing thing to me is that, and I've said this many times, when the Green Party in New York, we had a mayor and deputy mayor in New Paltz, and they started doing same-sex marriages in 2003 or 4. And the Democratic Attorney General of the state got an injunction against that. And the mainstream LGBT equality groups were saying, oh, we're going to spark a backlash. That was a period when Karl Rove, Bush's brain, was, putting these anti-gay ballot initiatives to mobilize the base for Bush. And instead of promoting a backlash, it sparked a movement and a massive transformation of public opinion. I mean, early on, excuse my language. What's the guy's name? Bush's vice president. I'm blanking on it. Dick Cheney. He has a lesbian daughter, and he said, yeah, he's for marriage equality. And I think that helped a lot to move, the more conservative people. But I think the bigger thing to move people is, most people in their families or friends have, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people, and they want to see those people, have the same rights as the rest of us. And so that public opinion on that flipped in less than a decade to the point where we got marriage equality passed in a lot of states and then approved by the Supreme Court. So I think, one of the lessons of that is don't hold back on your demands because you think they're not popular. If they're right, if they're the right thing to do, go ahead and do it. And most people want to do the right thing. And a lot of times on these issues, people are like in the back of their mind thinking, yeah, I'm with that, but I'm not going to go public on it because my friends, my peers won't approve. But once you get the sense that people, do approve, then everybody comes out of the woodwork. And I think that's what happened in this case. I've seen that happen on so many issues. So, don't hold back, do what's right. And then, try to persuade people to come to your point of view. And more often than not, if we can do that, they will. John Wood, what do you think of nonpartisan offices in municipal elections? Often there's no left alternative to standard Dems running cities. Should cities revert to bicameralism without the filibuster? Well, I don't like nonpartisan offices. That comes out of the progressive era where middle-class elites wanted to get rid of the machines that the Democrats and Republicans, depending on the city, ran. There was a lot of patronage and graft and corruption. So they thought if they made it nonpartisan and kind of technocratic, that it would clean up government. It would also prevent socialists from getting elected. A lot of them were getting elected in that period too. And that was another of the concerns of the elite progressives. And the fact is, in nonpartisan elections in many cities, everybody knows who the Democrat and Republican is. And if somebody's agreeing, they know that too. So it really doesn't remove the partisanship. It just means the partisan label is not on the ballot. So I think I'm not for nonpartisan elections at any level. And there's no left alternative to standard Dems running cities. There's a vacuum there because the Republicans are not serious competitors for those offices in most cities. And the Greens can right away become the progressive alternative and win a lot of those seats. And we should do more of that. And by the same token, in the rural areas that are more Republican, we can do the same thing because the Democrats don't run serious candidates. So then revert to bicameralism without the filibuster. I don't know if we've had much bicameralism at the city level. That's two chambers. Maybe I'm not sure what you meant by that. Bicameralism without the filibuster, I think, you definitely need. I think, unicameral legislative bodies, certainly at the city level. We have it in Nebraska, of all states, at the state level. And I don't know why we shouldn't have it at the federal level. I would just as soon see a proportionally elected House and the Senate be gotten rid of because it's disproportionate. And it was designed to slow down legislation, to be a conservative or a conserving institution in the way the Constitution was set up. And that makes it hard for popular movements that are behind a reform to get it through, because it has to go through both of the houses. And often the Senate is a bastion of conservatism because it gives two senators to what has been since slavery times the mostly rural white conservative parties or states. And so what is the number I saw? It's like 16, I think it's 16 senators from the smallest states, or maybe it's the 16 smallest Republicans from the smallest states, have as much voting power. No, they had as many votes as the two Democrats elected from California. It's just disproportionate. It's not one person, one vote. It's just a anti-majoritarian institution. So I'd be for unicameralism at the federal level and abolish the U.S. Senate. The problem there is, to do that through an amendment, you need universal or what's the word? Unanimous consent from all the senators to even get it to the point where the states could vote on it. The only alternative to that is to have a convention for a new constitution, called by a constitutional convention called by, I think it's 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the states. It's hard to do, but it's something we should talk about, because the Senate is illegitimate if you're talking about democracy. I see in the notes, John Wood said bicameralism existed in municipalities. Philadelphia had the largest bicameral legislature in the U.S. Okay, yeah, there. Okay, I didn't know that. That's interesting. But I don't see why bicameralism solves any problems that we have right now. I think the problem we have now is one-party rule. In most of the cities, it's Democrats. In a few conservative places, it's Republicans. But what we need is proportional representation. So all the points of view are there, and you don't have the polarization between two parties, which at the national level right now has people voting for the Democrats as a lesser evil because they're afraid of the Republicans, even in municipal elections, because people see the national news and they're progressive minded, they're scared of what the Republicans might do, and they aren't that aware of what's going on in their city. So they just vote for the Democrats. I mean, we've had cases where I've been in races where I was me against a Democrat, and I'd be knocking on doors and people say, well, I can't vote for you, even though I like what you're saying, because I'm afraid of the Republican. I say, there is no Republican. And a lot of people, even then, were kind of skeptical. Like, really? Are you trying to put one over on me? So that's a problem in basically the political consciousness, that a lot of people, and they get it reinforced through their unions and the Democratic Party, that the Greens are going to elect Republicans, and they'll use that even in races where there are Republicans. It's kind of crazy, but that's why you've got to have, in a campaign, you got to have the ability to reach the voters with your message and explain to them, what the real deal is. via email. What happens now that an appeals court has thrown out the special master in Trump's case? Well, Trump appeals to try to delay it even further to the Supreme Court. I mean, that master's thing that was done at the district court is so, I don't know how to say it without being, I don't know what a lawyer would say. I'd just call it illegal. The judge just made stuff up. I don't even think the Supreme Court is going to, uphold what that district court judge did. But Trump, we know what he does. He's going to try to string it out as long as he can. So I think that's the next step. And he's hoping to get a Republican House, starts investigating Biden in the January 6th committee, and creates a lot of smoke so people don't pay too much attention to what's going on with his documents case. But I don't think it's going to stop it. It's just going to slow it down. I think the Justice Department has finally said that we're going to nail this guy because this is just beyond the pale. John Wood, urban planning and politics go hand in hand to shape the realities of the working class. Should we staff housing and community development boards and commissions as Greens to sway policy? Yeah, I think so. We should be there where they are, making, like planning boards, making decisions on what development projects get approved or not. I mean, I've always advocated that part of our municipal program should be that these particularly planning boards should not just be, boards where private developers come in and get their plans approved or not. They should really be, proactive planning boards that decide with input from the community, preferably community assemblies that talk about what they want in their own neighborhoods, and then put out for bid. We want somebody to come in and do this project. And then the developers come in and bid on that project rather than coming in with their own plans, which are more about their making money than what's good for the community. But yeah, those are places where, Greens will get, the kind of inside information that you won't get unless you have really good local reporting in your newspapers and television stations, which I don't know any community that still has that. So to find this stuff out, you got to go do your own reporting. Well, if we have Greens on these boards and commissions, we're getting the information that can then be brought back to the Greens and out to the community. And that will, also make our Greens more educated on municipal issues so that when they run for elected offices, and some of these, commissions and boards are elected, but if they want to run for the city council or mayor, they've already got they're steeped in the local issues. So yeah, I think definitely that's an area where our local Green chapters should be emphasizing. Mitchell Human, 15-year-old student here. As a follow-up to my questions from last week, do you believe that required classes in trades and such can help lower the negative feelings toward blue-collar jobs? Well, I don't know if required is the way to go, but maybe it is. Maybe as part of graduating, you should at least take a class or two in one of the trades and mix it up with the students that are more focused on developing their trade. But I definitely think that people that want to go into the trades and in school should not be seen as and promoted as less than the people on academic paths. And I think really we should have students doing both academic training, college prep courses, as well as, learning a trade or two, or, at least taking some classes. Because, when we denigrate those, blue collar trades, we end up with a labor shortage. And you get a lot of young people that think they're not worthy unless they, got the academic training for a white collar desk job. And, blue collar work, anybody can sit on their butt. And I've seen it, they can make like they're working hard when in fact they're on their phone or reading their email. And it's hard to measure their productivity compared to what, You're on a construction site, you got to produce or you're not going to keep the job. And you got to know what you're doing or you're not going to keep the job. So those are real jobs and they make a real material difference. They're important. And so we should not be denigrating, uh, students that are in the trades. But that's an interesting idea, as a graduation requirement, having even those in college prep tracks having to take a course or two in the trades. That would be an interesting idea. I hadn't considered that before, but I think it's worth consideration. Jason Kotzinger, thoughts on Hakeem Jeffries' new role? I'd say he's the perfect pick to maintain the status quo. He's a corporate Democrat. He used to be a corporate lawyer. Yeah, you've answered the question there, brother. It's not a new role for Hakeem Jeffries. He's just got a higher rank in the House Democratic caucus structure, the highest rank now. And yeah, he'll be a good friend to corporate America and an enemy to those progressives in the Democratic Party. I mean, he had a super PAC that he, was very involved in that aimed at going after progressives like AOC and Rashid Tlaib and, Summer Lee, who just won. And I can't remember exactly who he targeted, but he is hostile to the progressives in the Democratic Party, let alone independent of the Democratic Party. For example, in New York, where they passed this draconian ballot access law, he hadn't said anything against that. He's not for democracy. He's just for Democrats and the capitalists that back them. Scout Trooper 164. Do you think Americans are drowning in loneliness? I'm asking because Crystal Hill, who's that? Is that Crystal Ball from the Hill? I think that's maybe who you meant. Did a video on that where people don't really get to interact with others. Yeah, it's even if people don't feel lonely, they are isolated. We've laid out, we're talking about urban planning before. We've laid out our urban environment for sprawl, where people live in, tract homes with their own driveways and garages, and they drive to work, they drive to shop, and then they drive home, and don't have many places where they can congregate with other people in public space. So they're isolated, have limited interaction with other people except by electronic means and what the media is broadcasting at them. So I think that's a problem. And for some people, that means loneliness. For others, it means just having a warped perspective on what's going on in your community. So I think we need, in terms of urban design, we need to, emphasize public transit where people, if you're going to the same transit stop every weekday morning to go to work, so are a lot of other people, and that's an opportunity to get to know more people. Having shopping and work and residence and recreation within walking distance in compact communities is just going to provide, natural situations where people will get to know each other and interact. And that's good for the society. And I think for people's, health. I think there's studies that show that the more, friends and acquaintances interaction you have with people, generally the more healthy you're going to be, as opposed to people who are isolated. So I don't know if it's loneliness, but certainly isolation. There's too much of that. Patrick Palladino, is the only thing we can do now a general strike? Seems nothing seems to work. Yeah, well, general strike is easier said than done. You've got to get everybody wanting to go out. So it's massive organizing. I think that's the culmination of a process rather than where we start. When people are ready to go on a general strike, it's like the last straw. They've had it. And you study the general strikes we've had in this country and other countries. And I'm not talking about the, sort of formalized general strikes some of the European unions do. France does it a lot. Italy does it a lot. where all the unions agree to take a day off in March and then they go back to work the next day. And, so the bosses take a day off and then go back to work. It doesn't have that big an impact. But a general strike that's disruptive. You look at where it's happened, I'm thinking now the Teamsters in Minneapolis, they were mistreated and violence perpetuated on them by the police, and the city came out in support and went on strike with them. And that's the kind of thing you see in the Seattle general strike, the San Francisco, Oakland general strike. And anywhere you look around the world, that's kind of how it develops. So that means we've got to, work in our own jobs, industries to develop the labor movement. And if we're in a community or working through community organizations, support the labor movement and build a relationship with them. But I think, there are all kinds of tactics we should be using, public education, internal education within our movements. I mean, we should be reading things together and talking about them, and, taking turns presenting a summary of the reading to start discussion, which develops people as speakers. And, we can give friendly criticism of how they can improve their presentation. Doing things like that in our locals develops us as organizers and activists. So there's education, public and internal. And then just, demonstrations, protests, public forums on an issue to advance that issue, like single-payer healthcare. But we have to realize that if that's all we do, the incumbents, generally the Democrats who are lobbying, most likely to maybe vote for that, can take us for granted if we aren't also running candidates that compete for those votes of progressive-minded people. So we got to employ all the tactics. And I see a general strike as like we elect a progressive government, a green government, and it starts instituting reforms, and then the capitalists stop investing and using the media to try to, make scandals out of nothing for the people that were elected and providing obstruction to the process of, carrying forward the reforms. And when they disinvest from the economy to wreck it and blame the reformers, that's the time for a general strike. And not just a strike, but maybe to take over the means of production directly and tell the bosses, we really don't need you. You don't do any work. And we can hire our own management to coordinate things. I think that's when a general strike scenario that can, in the traditional wobbly sense of IWW, the International Industrial Workers of the world, in their sense of how a general strike would transform society, I think it's not the first step. It's kind of the culminating step in a transfer of power from capitalist elites to working people. Frankie Lee, Howie, what can we do to pressure Big Pharma to develop vaccines to diseases like Cuba has with cancer? How do we demand quality of life as a human right? We got to just take over Big Pharma, get rid of these patents that make these vaccines and other drugs more expensive than they need to be. They should be provided to the public at cost as a public service, not a buy or die commodity. We've got a problem, with these mRNA vaccines that have been effective with COVID, but not available around the world at a cost the poorer countries can afford because we haven't lifted the patents. There's a proposal from South Africa and India that's been around since the beginning of the pandemic, calling for them to lift the patents for the pandemic so these vaccines can get distributed to the poorer countries. And, while Biden gave some lip service to doing that, he didn't do it. He didn't back it up. The negotiations we know in the World Trade Organization, the U.S. basically threw a roadblock in there, as did other EU countries, Germany and the UK in particular. So I don't want to pressure Big Pharma. I want to take them over. I think that's the demand. What pressure can they feel from us? We can elect, and realistically, Democrats who are going to rail against big pharma, but in the end, the progressive Democrats are weak. They're the minority within the Democratic Party in the House, and so they can propose legislation to rein in big pharma, but it's not going to pass. So what we really need is an independent political party like the Green Party that's about socializing big pharma and making these vaccines and other medicines available at cost as a public service, not a marketable commodity. How do we demand quality of life as a human right? Well, we've got a lot of the elements of a good quality of life in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights declarations. And so what we need to do is fight for bills that begin to implement that, like Medicare for all, improved and expanded Medicare for all, and preferably, as I've argued, as a national health service, just not a national health insurance program. In terms of housing, we should radically expand public housing. It accounts for less than 1% of the units in this country. In many European countries, it's 20, even 30% in different cities and regions. And what that does is make the private rental market compete with the public rental market. And it brings prices down closer to their cost rather than cost plus enormous speculative profits. So I think we don't want to pressure big business. We want to basically take them over and have them run in the interests of the public. John Wood, what's your take on a land value tax? How do we reliably and sustainably fund government and its various services with taxes? Excuse me. Well, I am for the land value tax, not as a single tax as old Henry George advocated, but as one of many taxes that are progressive. And you want a diversity of taxes because different taxes generate different revenues in different economic conditions. So you want that diversity so you sustainably fund government. So I think a land value tax, and that's where you basically tax the marketable value of the land, but not the improvements on it. And what that does is encourage people who own land to improve it, but not hold it in speculation waiting for the land value to go up. And when land value does go up, it's because of social investments that around the land that's not developed, or even land that is developed, but you haven't improved. You just kept it as it is, with whatever, buildings or businesses or homes are on top of it. And that's unearned. It's an unearned income. It's John Stuart Mill called it, said something like it, you're making money while you sleep. And that's really not returning earnings to labor, it's just returning only earnings to a property owner. So the land value tax has a lot of things to speak for it, but we should also have progressive income, wealth, estate, financial transaction, and ecological taxes. A land value tax is an ecological tax because you're taxing a scarce resource, land. You're not making more of it. So you should have ecological taxes on the extraction of minerals, and also on the release of pollutants to disincentivize those things. So that would include a carbon tax. I think to make it progressive, you have a full or partial rebate on a progressive basis so that the people most dependent, who have the least income to handle the additional carbon tax on top of their fuel taxes, on top of their fuel costs, get some money back. And in fact, most models show that it'll actually be progressive redistribution to the bottom half or 2/3 of the population, because the largest amount of burning of fossil fuel per capita is at the top of the income spectrum. So they would pay the most carbon taxes. So yeah, land value tax, yes, and but we need a variety of taxes. It shouldn't be the single tax that some Henry George fans advocate. Scout Trooper 164, Howie, what are your thoughts on people getting agitated over Disney's recent movie being LGBT friendly? Well, they need to get over it. They're in the minority now, and they should begin to see LGBT people as people. And I'm not sure what movie you're referring to, but this culture war stuff is really not about the actual cultural issue. It's about mobilizing right wing people or people to the right wing, and it's about scapegoating these people for social problems that they didn't create. And so, if people are feeling economically insecure or socially insecure because their community, in the case of racism, it used to be all white and now it's getting more mixed, and they're uncomfortable about that. That's what's going on here. It's really not about LGBT people so much as it's about mobilizing a right wing reaction that in the end, the rich people funding it really don't care about that either too much. They mostly care about getting right wingers in office who won't tax them, who won't regulate them. I mean, when you look at the people funding some of this right wing culture war stuff, they're not culture warriors themselves. They're sort of libertarian type capitalist tycoons who don't want taxes and don't want regulation. John Wood, should we implement many of the reforms you talk about? Ranked choice voting, proportional representation, publicly funded elections, mixed member districts. I think you mean multi-member districts. Citizens commissions for redistricting at the municipal level. Yes, and I'm not for independent citizens commission for redistricting. I'm for proportional representation. Well, let me put it this way. You get rid of single member district winner take all. You don't need to worry too much about how the district lines are drawn because it's proportional representation. And so the independent redistricting thing, I think, is kind of a side show to really go into multi-member ranked choice voting, so you get proportional representation at the municipal level. We just did that in 3 cities in the last election: Portland, Maine, Portland, Oregon, and Ojai, California. And we can do it in a lot more. I haven't counted up how many cities do it, but I know Cambridge, Massachusetts does, Albany, California does, Palm Desert, California does, East Point, Michigan does, Arden, Maryland does. So I don't know how many that was. It's getting toward 10. It should be 100. And then we get it into state legislatures and the U.S. House of Representatives. That'll make a world of difference, because then the Green Party will be, like it is in most other countries, an ongoing part of the political discussion between elections as rather during in addition to during elections. So I don't see all the other items you had on your list, but to me, the proportional ranked choice voting is the real game changer. We can get ranked choice voting in single member districts that are still winner take all, and we'll be able to run without the spoiler effect, but we're still not going to win our proportional share of seats proportional to our real support in society. We saw that in Australia. For years, the Greens have single member district instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting for their House. For their Senate is proportional representation from multi-member regions. So the Greens were a 10% party. I think they were 12 or 13% in the last election. They get their proportional share in the Senate. But in the House, which has 150 members or maybe 151, they had 1 seat until this last election where they got 4. But that's due to very good, strong organizing and favorable districts to them, where they beat the winner-take-all 2-party logic. But that's hard to do compared to the Senate, where for years the Greens have had their proportional representation. So that's why we need to push for proportional ranked choice voting and not settle for single member district ranked choice voting, which is still winner take all. and biased toward the two major parties. Howie, where do you stand on the concept of ethical capitalism? Man, I don't think there's such a thing. You know, capitalism is about maximizing profit in order to survive in the market. And to maximize profit, you minimize your labor costs so the workers don't get their full share of the value they create. It's about where you can get away with it, externalizing costs, like pollution, like social benefits. Um, so, there's nothing ethical about that. It's basically you're trying to make money at the expense of other people in nature. So, the whole concept of capitalism, which should not be equated with markets. A lot of people do that. The core of capitalism is the property relationship, where the owner of capital gets to appropriate all the surplus value. And, after paying the wages and the cost of materials, basically, the rest belongs to the owner, even though the value was created by the worker's labor. And that's institutionalized theft. That's not ethical. Okay, our hour is up. I don't see another question. I appreciate people being here and asking the questions. There's so much to talk about. Next week, um, I'm going to see if I can get a guest to talk about the question of degrowth, which is a hot issue in eco-socialism. I have somebody in mind who's very good. He's got a slideshow ready to go. I just got to ask him if he can do it next Saturday. But I'm going to try to do that. And then the Saturday after, we'll have Claire Cohen, and we'll focus on the healthcare crisis. And, we'll just keep going and, talk about these issues and get organized for what's coming ahead. So have a good week, everybody, and I'll see you next week.